All right, welcome everyone to a webinar on feminist systems change. We're going to share reflections, frames, learning to advance the practice of a feminist approach to systems change. I'm super excited. We were just sharing before we invited everyone into the room that this is, I think, the first event that Systems Sanctuary and Co-Creative have done together. We've been doing a lot of work together on building the field and practice of systems change through Illuminate. But this is the first kind of fun thing we get to do just on our own between the two organizations. So super thrilled to introduce Rachel Sinha and Tatiana Fraser, our colleagues who are the principals at Systems Sanctuary. Highly encourage you to check out Systems Sanctuary. They have a terrific newsletter that's full of news and information, tools, resources, etc. They have really excellent master classes, very intimate kind of peer learning experiences, which we've heard really terrific reviews about. And they're going to be sharing with us today around feminist systems change, kind of a systems change framework that they've been developing based on feminist theory and philosophy and principles, as one way of thinking about the capacities and practices in systems change work. So we're all whole human beings, and we want to invite you to, if you would, turn on your video. I'm going to stop the share here. You can also go to gallery view in Zoom. We can see one another, and let's just unmute and give each other a human hello. If you turn on your video, we can actually see one another too.
Good
and
morning.
We're not worried about
Morning,
dogs
everyone.
or babies or dirty laundry or any of that.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
On Donna.
Good
morning.
Morning.
All right, so we're recording this session. Just want everyone to be aware of that. We do share the recordings of our webinars publicly. So what we won't do, though, is show your names. We just don't want to share your image with your name without your permission. But the webinar will be available. You'll be able to share it with folks, etc. Also want to remind you, this is a 90-minute session. Sometimes people get on, they think 60 minutes, but we're going to go the whole 90 because, hey, it's worth it. And let's see, I just want to share a bit about the session flow here. Before I do that, this is who Co-Creative is. I'm joined by my colleague, Melissa, who will speak to you here in a minute. My name is Russ Gaskin. I'm one of the principals at Co-Creative. And essentially, we help people who don't know each other, and sometimes, maybe not often, don't even like each other, to do systems change work together. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to do, as we do in each of our webinars, some connecting. So to get a sense of who we are as a whole group of people, and then also some more intimate connecting in small groups. And we're then going to do a kind of a transitional meditation so we can all get our heads and hearts and bodies into the space together. And then Rachel and Tatiana are going to share about the framework and stories and examples, etc. And then we'll just open it up for some discussion. So I think we're over to connecting here. Melissa?
Thanks, Russ. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be in this space with you. We're so happy that you're joining us. We want to do some spicy and brief introductions here to help us gather a sense of who is with us today. And so you can see Russ has dropped a link into the chat. We want to invite you to go to slido.com. Just click on that link and share with us your name and introduction, where you're joining from today, so a place that we could find on a map, and then one value that consistently informs your life and work. We'll take just a few minutes to let folks populate that. And I think we're ready to share the results screen here.
We've got about just over half the people have responded. If you just joined, there's a link to the Slido poll in the Zoom chat. If you could click on that, just share your name and organization. A couple other questions there so we can get to know who this group of people is.
Thanks, Russ. I just dropped the link in again too for folks who have just joined us. So lots of folks that we, familiar names and some new names. The Academy for Systems Change, some folks from Humboldt County, Action Corps, Homeless Link, some more of our co-creative colleagues. Ashley Moon is here from A Moon Design, Humboldt Area Foundation, Polk County Health Department, Good Seed Digital, some folks from the UK, Change Grow Live, hi Beck. Allison is here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're getting a sense of where people are coming from. So looks like some folks from Iowa, from Eugene, Oregon, Baltimore, Maryland, the UK, as we said, Chico, California, Norway, Ontario, other folks from Canada, Vermont, Massachusetts, our friends in Humboldt County, Olympia, Washington. Some folks are naming the ancestral people for the places where they are joining from, Wiyot country. Marianne is joining us from the unceded Coast Salish territories, Washington State, Helena, Montana. And these are the values that you all collectively are bringing to our time together. Love, honesty, service, compassion, trauma-informed care, adventure, justice. Thank you so much for bringing these to your life, to your work, and to this collective space together.
All right, so next we want to do some more intimate connecting. We got a little bit of sense of who's joined us at the as a whole group here. But we also know that people like these webinars because you get to meet other cool people who are doing great work around the world. So we're going to make some breakout rooms, maybe 3 people, 4 people might be in a couple. And we invite you to share in the breakout discussion, maybe your name and just a line about your role, like a brief, spicy and brief line about what you do. What inspired you to join today's session? And a woman-identified person who's made a difference in the world, whom you would like to presence today, and maybe a bit about why you want to presence that person today. So we just ask you to be mindful of speaking time. You have 8 minutes together in your group. Melissa, are we good to go?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to share a link to the Slido poll again in the Zoom chat and invite you as Rachel and Tatiana. Rachel and Tatiana are going to start sharing just in a bit here. As they're sharing and presenting about the stories and framework around feminist systems change, we invite you to use that Slido poll to share whatever's coming up for you. It may be questions, it may be observations, insights, reactions, etc. You'll be able to both contribute and see what other people are contributing. And if you see something that really resonates with you, maybe you have the same question, you can give a thumbs up and vote for that. So when we open up for discussion, we'll start with maybe what's emerged in the Slido poll. You'll see the prompt is pretty straightforward. It's simply what's standing out to you. So I want to welcome Tatiana and Rachel. By the way, I forgot to mention, a lot of people come to Co-Creative for learning. We go to System Sanctuary for learning. So it's really, really terrific resources that they share. And I'm looking forward to learning from Rachel and Tatiana right now. Tatiana, I think we're over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really special to be here with all of you today. It's, yeah, we're really excited to have this opportunity to sit with Co-Creative and to sit with you and to share our work with you as well. And so before we get into it, before we get into the framework and the discussion, we will do a little meditation just to help everybody land a little bit more and to, yeah, presence yourself just a little bit more. So I'm going to invite you all into just a brief, it's a short meditation, it won't be long. And if you are not comfortable meditating, feel free to adapt it. If you don't want to close your eyes, keep your eyes open. If you want to turn your video off, feel free to do that. And it's a breathing meditation that I will guide us through. So you can feel you plant your feet on the ground and connect to the earth that we're all connected to, wherever we may be planted. So let's take a few breaths together, breathing in, exhale. And as you're breathing, start to become aware of your body. Start to become aware of your senses, of your feeling. Let's start with a scan. So as you're taking your breath in and out, start to scan your body and just notice how you're feeling in your heart, in your belly. Feel your buttocks in your seat. Let them sink in. Your feet on the floor. And just notice if you're holding any tension, emotional tension. And we'll start with that. Just scan your body for any emotional tension you might be holding on to. Locate that. We're going to do a series of 3 breaths where you breathe in and then you hook onto that tension. And then as you exhale, you let it ride out. The tension rides out on the out breath. And we'll do that 3 times. So again, just focus on where you're feeling that emotional tension. And we'll do a breathe in, hook on that tension, and let it ride out. And then again, breathing in, hook on the tension, and let it ride out. And then one more time, breathing in. And exhale, let it ride out. The out breath. And then let's do a scan for any physical pain that you might be feeling, any muscle pain or anything you're holding or yeah, sensing in your body. And we'll do the same thing. So let's take a deep breath in, hook on the pain and just let it ride out. Again, breathing in. Exhale. And last one, breathing in. And let it ride out. So now just take a few breaths in and again, just bringing awareness into your body and try to just feel a little more spaciousness around your heart, a little more spaciousness around your solar plexus, around your whole body. Feel just a letting go and a little more room. And take a last breath together, breathing in. Roll your shoulders. Let go of any tension you might be holding there. Exhale. Give it a little shake. And then we'll come back together to our circle. So I hope that grounds you a little bit as we kind of shift into some conversation. So what we're going to do today, it's a real honor, as I said, to be here with you all. And we're going to share with you our framework that we've developed that we call feminist systems change, and how we kind of weave together feminist practice and systems change that are quite aligned. So we will share that framework. We'll give you some examples about how we're using and practicing some concrete examples of what that looks like. And then we'll move into a discussion, kind of Q&A. So we'd like to hear from you and hear what resonates and if you have questions about it. And just to begin with, Rachel and I will just contextualize where we're coming from, what inspired us to arrive here today. So to start off with, I can say that how did we come together, Rachel and I, in our systems work and in the sanctuary? And my work started out many, many years ago. I co-founded an organization called Girls Action Foundation, which worked at creating empowerment, leadership, social justice spaces for girls and young women, and really addressing a number of issues. Very intersectional. So from mental health to gender-based violence, to leadership, to social change and transformation. And that's where I kind of began the work that I did. And it came from at that time, I kind of cut my teeth on feminist activism with an intersectional feminist analysis. And what that means is that when we're talking about gender, we're not talking about kind of a binary male female. There's a recognition of the intersections of kind of context and history and identity and culture that mean, we're looking at intersections of race and class and ability and sexual identity. And so, we don't experience systems in the same way. And there are many intersecting kind of contexts that impact the way in which people experience systems. And so that's the kind of feminist thread that informed our work. And at the time, I was very, very fortunate to do a master's program to study change work with thought leaders based in Canada, Brenda Zimmerman and Frances Wesley, who were in the Canadian context kind of at the forefront of systems change and social innovation at the time. So I was very informed by complexity theory. I was a student of complexity theory, and I was able to weave that in to how we built and scaled the work that Girls Action did, which started at kind of a local grassroots level and scaled across the country. And so that was, at the time, really innovative and really an interesting journey. And so for myself, when I stepped away from that work, I stepped down and transitioned out of my role as executive director. And I was really preoccupied with systems change because I knew from a feminist perspective, we were doing that. Like we were working at the root causes that was inherent in kind of feminist work. And similarly, there are lots of people doing systems change work, and they don't necessarily call it systems change. People come to systems change from different lineages. So I knew we were doing it, but at the same time, I was really grappling with like how to communicate it, how to do evaluation. Like I wanted more. I wanted to be able to like go deeper and understand the systems change that we were doing. And so I went on a systems change journey. I was really, again, fortunate to be brought into a group of thought leaders, or excuse me, senior leaders in Canada, who were really inquiring into the edges of systems change practice. And so at that time, we were kind of walking together, and that's when I met Rachel, who was part of that circle, that group of people. She came into it, and she and I both shared this passion and this belief in the fact that we don't have systems change figured out. We don't have all the answers in systems change. And we really, coming from a place of practice as doers in the world, as systems entrepreneurs in the world, having that experience, we had a strong belief in the possibility of collective learning, that if we could create collective peer learning spaces, we could emerge a kind of collective intelligence over time, an iterative collective intelligence that could help inform our action to bring kind of wisdom and learning into the action. And that was kind of the impetus for creating the system sanctuary, and the kind of core belief that we have in creating learning spaces, recognizing we don't have systems change figured out, and we're learning through the doing of systems change. So that's what kind of brought us together. And Rachel, I'll hand it over to you. Before I do that, I should have mentioned that I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Kanakahage people, otherwise known as Montreal. I'm based here. And Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tatiana. So I'm originally from the UK, and I moved to the US about 6 years ago. And I live on the unceded territory of the Osage people, which is otherwise known as St. Louis in Missouri. I got into system change work because I co-founded a project in the UK called the Finance Innovation Lab that was launched after the 2008 financial crisis. And it was a partnership between WWF and the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. And it was really a place where we kind of tried to capture the energy that was created after that crisis and bring together stakeholders from across the system to get organized in different ways to try and create coalitions for change or new business models for change and leadership programs. And we worked with the kind of Occupy Wall Street movement at the time, and the Big Four accountancy firm, and the UN Environment Programme, and all sorts of different things. And I co-led that project for about 8 years with 2 other women. And when we span it out, I very much felt, and it became an independent charity that's still going today, my main reflection was just that it was really difficult. Most of the time we didn't know what we were doing, and we were making it up as we went along. And there were lots of people watching and lots of stakeholders around that were trying to influence. And I thought that there were real leadership challenges with working in this particular way. And so I really was motivated when I moved to the US to try and create support systems for people who were leading systems change work, because I recognize that it's difficult, and that the very most useful thing that I found was finding somebody else at a conference who was doing something roughly similar and sitting down with them at the sidelines and having a conversation about practice and, what are you doing and what's working, what's not working, and why. At the same time, I was in my early 30s, I think, and late 30s, I'm not sure. I was having babies, and I moved to the States. I had no network, no family, no friends, no anything. I sort of moved away from my support system. Had 2 very young kids, was living in New York at the time, and it was really difficult. I was the breadwinner of our family. And so I had to kind of start a company immediately, and I met Tatiana at that point as well. And I think that was really one of the other things that played into our conversation about systems change work, that she was like, this is a gendered situation. We should have a conversation about what's going on here. And, so one of the first programs that we ever started together was called the System Sisterhood, which was supporting women who were leading systems change work, who were going through a life transition. So anything from aging into being a change maker, but aging, being a woman who was stepping into a big job or stepping away from a big job, because that can also be a really weird transition, or having babies, choosing not to have children, going through a divorce. There's all sorts of life transitions that women were having, and we were like, where's a support system for the people who are going through those, because there is so much potential in this group of people, but it can be lost because those transitions are really difficult. And so, yeah, I will just share that that's kind of how I came into this work. And Tatiana is going to share a bit more about our framework and talk about how it works in practice.
Wonderful, thanks. All right, so the framework. I would begin by sharing a little story about when, then this is a bit of, these are seeds of the work that got us to where we are today. As Rachel said, we together facilitated the sisterhood early on in the sanctuary days, and at the same time, we were doing quite a bit of research, working with women systems leaders, but also with people who were doing feminist social justice work or social change. So we were working with, for example, a collaborative of about 8. Actually, it was a national project with 8 collaboratives across the country working to address access to housing, access to justice, and access to economic security. So we were working in these contexts and doing research about how is gender's kind of specific systems change working in the world, and what are we learning? And that's a lens that we have kind of brought into the work that we're doing in this sort of action research way. But early on, while I was actually still at Girls Action Foundation and we were building kind of a change theory, we were learning a lot about scale and how systems change, we often talk about scaling up in terms of systems change, which is when you're moving from doing an innovation or a service or in the change world, and you're actually intervening at a policy level, at the structural level, and you're impacting your systems change that way. So this was a very kind of common way to think about how we were doing systems change or how people achieve that. And the other dimension of scale, it was scaling out, so which is replicating or franchise-like sort of sharing and growing the impact of your work. So these were the 2 frames that we were kind of learning about in the work that Frances Wesley and Brenda was leading at the time. And what intuitively wasn't working was that I felt that we were scaling deep, like we were actually in kind of the depths of the work. And so at that time, that's when we built that kind of into our framework to say there's another dimension here that's really important. And so we've held that kind of through the work, and you'll see it resonates with the ways we think about framing. So just to think about that, that's one context. And now today, scaling deep, actually, when we talk about that, we're thinking about kind of the personal transformational work that is required in doing systems change work, and also the cultural level work, which is really getting at beliefs and values, and it's that intangible kind of murky space, but where really powerful things can happen. And also that's a space that we don't quite understand. So the thing with feminist practice is that it helps us to start to really make sense of that work and articulate it as well. So I think we can bring up let's bring up the slides again. And I'll just start by saying, by sharing that feminist practice and systems practice, the thing that really kind of struck me is that they're aligned, right? They're both working at shifting harmful systems into new ways of being. And from a feminist perspective, we can think, we're shifting hierarchical systems, violent systems, dominant systems into new ways of being that are more collaborative, that are more, power sharing, that take into consideration relationship and relationality. So the alignment for the hopes for feminist practice and change is really strong with systems change. But there's also there's an area, what I think is also an opportunity and is really inspiring, is that when we're thinking about the two, is that feminist practice offers some things that are missing in systems change. And systems change can really strengthen the hopes and aspirations of feminist work as well. So there's an alignment and also a complementarity that can happen. So what we point out is that feminist practice brings a power analysis that is missing. So a large part of the work here is bringing consciousness, a lens, analysis, and practice that is understanding power. And on the other hand, systems change brings the relational, really values the relational, and looks at that interconnectivity. You know, we often say in systems change, it's all about relationships, right? And so there's a tension here with power, because I think if we only focus on relationships and we're not questioning the, you know, who's in the room, who has access, who's you know, leading, who has access to the resources, then we're missing something really, really important. And on the other hand, you know, in social justice and social change spaces, and the work we're doing with gender specific issues is like, there's a need to really bring in the care and the love and the relationship and really nurture that in the work. So another example is feminism politicizes the gendered and often discriminatory nature of care. So in systems change, one of the core values I think that we're working towards is to shift towards systems of care, cultures of care. And it's really important that we understand that from a gendered and racialized and lens. There's a lot of power and intersectional issues when we're thinking about care and systems of care. And then systems change invites us, you know, into really thinking about cultures of healing and cultures of care as well. Feminism is also at the cutting edge of binary breaking. So working around challenging assumptions of gender identity and challenging binaries, you know, is a really important learning space. And then systems practice helps us to hold paradox as well. So that supports the thinking and the practice, the feminist practice. And finally, as I already mentioned, an intersectional lens helps us to see that multiple identities means we experience systems differently, which is so important. When we're trying to do systems change, who are we thinking about in terms of the impact of the system? And a systems lens brings in nuance to the idea of location and identity, which is really important. I think what I'm thinking about a lot these days that I really appreciate in systems work is, you know, when we're able to really drop into our humanity and into our complexity, and, you know, let go of kind of the labels and the job descriptions, you know, there's a lot of more room and creativity. So holding that tension there as well. So these are the ways in which feminist practice and systems change align and offer, you know, offer ways to strengthen each other as well. And so in the next slide, I'll just share, this is the framework that we have developed. And these kind of represent the capacities and the practices that we train through our masterclass, and that we focus on when we're working with teams and leaders in ecosystems. These are the capacities we kind of hope we facilitate teaching, but also practice, learning, etc. And so at the beginning, at the center of this, so the foundational kind of thinking that informs this is intersectional feminism, as I said, complexity theory and systems lens. So that's where we draw on, that's where we stand when we're thinking about practice and competencies. And on the inner circle, we have identified the feminist practices, and on the outer circle, the systems practices. So I'll just walk us through those. The first is centering lived experience. And so in systems change, you know, when we're working with ecosystems and when we're working in collaborative ways, how are we centering the lived experience of those who are experiencing the harms of the systems, are on the kind of front line of the harms of systems that we're actually trying to shift? How is their voice centered? How are these people centered in the work? And that's really important from a feminist perspective, and I think from a systems perspective. So that's first. then naming the meta systems. So, you know, we may be working in climate change, we may be working in poverty, sustainability, finance, but really recognizing and naming that there are through lines that cut across all systems, and they include patriarchy, they include colonization, they include white supremacy. And so naming those and making sure that we're paying attention to that as we walk through the work, the processes, is really important. And it invites that recognition into the room and into the work. And then the next piece is working across difference. And the way we think about this is, how do we create the conditions to work across difference, recognizing that in systems work, you know, we understand that ecosystems are healthy and thrive when they have a strong diversity. And there's a lot of attention and care that needs to be put into creating conditions to work across difference well in collaborations. And then the next one is shifting power. And in this capacity, it's really looking at, again, who is centered. It's asking questions like, how are the resources being distributed? And it's being intentional about where we are located in the system, and shifting kind of resources and power from the dominant system to the periphery, and ensuring that we're not just starting from the dominant system and staying within the mindset or the structures and systems of the dominant system. Like, how can we actually do systems change if we're only working from the dominant systems? And then centering care and healing is a practice that is really important, and that we kind of align more and more in the work that we're doing for systems change. I think the healing practices, recognizing that, you know, as we've learned from Melanie Goodchild from the Turtle Island Institute, she shares beautifully that healing self is healing to systems, that they're deeply connected. And so how do we draw those connections around healing self and healing systems in a way that is supportive? And then care, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're working to build cultures of care at all the multiple levels that we're working at. And then shifting to the outside, the practices then insist from a systems lens that align with the feminist is starting with locating yourself in the system. So we say, you know, we're not objective to the systems that we're trying to change. We're not disconnected. We are located in those systems. So having a reflexivity practice to really be on a learning journey about, how am I evolving? How am I learning about myself as I am connected to these systems that I'm changing? And then seeing the system, which is great fun, and the geeky parts that we love around mapping and collective seeing through using mapping tools, which help us do sense making, which help us see connections, which help us determine where we want to kind of move and act. And deepening relationships, again, this is so key and so important, and it's countercultural. I think it's one of the hardest things in systems change is to really slow down and honor and create the space for deepening relationships and centering those. And then working at multiple levels, which connects to kind of seeing the system. How are we working across the multiple levels, from the cultural kind of landscape to the regime, kind of institutional, to the innovation spaces, to the deep root systems that we talk about in scaling deep. And finally, the practices around learning and adapting. So how are we iterative and learning? How are we creating feedback loops back into the work that we're doing? And how are we able to adapt it so that we're working in an emergent way rather than a kind of traditional strategic way? So these are the capacities that we work with and that we train on, and that we consider as important in systems practice. And clearly it's interesting, we often hear people are looking for the step-by-step process. And, we kind of see these as surfing a wave, where, you draw on the capacities when you need them, and you're looking to strengthen where you may not be super strong. And then I'll just lastly say, it's also important that when in coming and practicing systems change, that people may come to systems change from different lineages and often will be really strong in some of these areas already. So it's important to recognize that and make that connection. So I'm going to hand it to Rachel, who's going to give some story to this and share some good examples of how this comes to life.
Yeah, thanks, Tatiana. So yeah, I'll just share a couple of examples of how it works in action, and then we'll do some Q&A. So Joanna Kerr is one person that came to us. She works with an organization called Make Way in Canada that's a kind of intermediary. And she had been convening a group of women identified people who are working on issues of climate change and care across Canada, and felt like the conversation, they were becoming frustrated that the conversation around climate change was always coming up with technical solutions, and some of the best ideas that they had were more cultural solutions, and they were often sidelined, and that there was a gendered dynamic that was going on there. And also they were convening during the early months of COVID, and so the conversation around care, like, how are your parents doing? How are your kids doing? How are you doing? How's your mental health amid this massive crisis? How are you caring for your community was also coming into that conversation. So they were having this side conversation, and they asked us to come together and create a peer learning group for them. So how this worked was that we convened a group of women identified leaders from across Canada who are working on issues of climate change. It was a very diverse group along age, which was really cool, actually, around sexual identity and race. We had a really great group of women who were really leading in interesting and innovative ways. And we convened them over a year and created a peer learning group. And at the end of that, we came up with a kind of systems map of these are the systemic challenges that they're facing as a group of individuals trying to do their work in the world. And I'll tell you more about the process in a moment. Another group, an example, is Sue Bookchin, who works on gender-based violence in Nova Scotia. She's been working on that issue for almost her entire career, and the issue has not changed. There are massive systemic barriers that are held in place by cultural issues, and she's hugely frustrated by it. And so she called together a group of individuals, about 25 people, who were representing different parts of the ecosystem. So there's everyone from police, people working in shelters, the African Nova Scotian community, the Indigenous Women's Centre, etc., etc. And we created a peer learning group for that group as well. We taught them systems thinking and systems practice theory, and we also created a peer learning group for them to really build and nurture and deepen relationships between those individuals. So today, what we do at the Systems Sanctuary is two things. We teach and train internationally on systems thinking and systems change practice, leaning on our experience of leading work ourselves. And we create these peer learning groups. And really the theory of change around those peer learning groups is that, you know, when we want to try and create change at a systemic level, it really helps to build, deepen, nurture, bridge relationships between the individuals who are already doing that work in the system. That, like, when we think about kind of the way that I was brought up on systems thinking, where we do a workshop for a few days and then we come away, you know, to me, I feel like it always stuck so much better when the relationships were nurtured. And so what we do in our kind of year-long programs is we create the conditions really for friendship to emerge between the individuals that are on those calls. So we start off with a grounding around an equity framework, and we have a conversation about our individual role in the system, talking about power and privilege in our story and how that contributes to our work. And then we use what we call a peer input process. So every single individual who's on the group takes a turn, and they will share a challenge that's keeping them up at night. And it actually feels very vulnerable doing that to the group. We then turn off the camera and the audio, and the rest of the group have a conversation about that challenge as if that person isn't there. And what happens is that that person feels hugely validated and heard. Of course, we're generating solutions to that challenge. Often the problem that somebody feels in that, is sharing is something that other people in that room have also shared. And so there's conversations about a difficult boss, or a completely unrealistic workload, or a systemic barrier around culture and funding that just keeps coming up. And Tatiana and I, really importantly, transcribe all of our calls, and we kind of treat it like almost like qualitative research. So we're capturing every single thing that people are saying, and then we're able to cluster and theme the challenges that people are facing along different lines. And then we bring in powerful systems change frameworks at the end of that process and map out the systemic barriers that we've heard in the conversations that this group of people have shared, and also the personal challenges, the cultural challenges, and we're able to use that data and that mapping process as a basis for building a really powerful ecosystem for positive change, so that we then go out for funding to get funding to build that ecosystem. And what we have is a group of 15 to 20 people who deeply care about each other, who know each other really well, have heard each other's personal stories, understand where they're all coming from, and a really strong strategy for where the systemic barriers are. And the success rate in winning funding when we're in that position is so much higher than the work that we've previously done. And so this is the way that we've been working and applying a kind of feminist and systems practice combined in our work. I'll hand over to Tatiana to take some questions.
So there you go. I think we can take the slide share off. And so that's the framework and some of the technical aspects of it, and then some stories around what we're doing. And we'd love now to just open it up and hear from you and have some discussion. Maybe we'll take a moment, let's take a minute, because it's a lot of information, just to think, and maybe you'd like to write down anything like that resonates for you, connections that you're seeing, or any questions that you have. Just take a minute, and then we'll open it up and invite questions.
Tatiana, I want to note that Melissa's put the Slido poll into the Zoom chat again. So please share there if you would, because you can also see what's coming up for other people. And as I said earlier, you can vote for things that resonate with you. And we'll also share the Slido poll results in the follow-up after the webinar.
Excellent, thank you. Let's just take a minute for that to collect your thoughts. Russ, I'm going to hand it to you then to facilitate the discussion.
Sure, just in case everyone's not seeing it, I'll share on the screen here. Now, of course, the risk in polling is we all look at what got a lot of votes. So we'll do that, and then we'll look at things that didn't get many votes and see what else is coming up here. So Tatiana, Rachel, we got a few votes for, I think I actually contributed this one because I was really curious about binary breaking and what that looks like in practice, in feminist practice specifically.
Great. I would say that for many years, the feminist space has been challenging binaries by one, I think the intersectionality piece, like recognizing that, there are intersections around our experiences, and then therefore, how do we collectively move around issues? And certainly, I think over the decades, and in my experience in feminist movements, like intersections of race have been brought to the fore, intersections around sexual identity have been brought to the fore, and ability have been brought to the fore. But one of, I think specifically around binary work is that the recognition, like using recognizing that there's a continuum around sexual identity, that, you know, there's not just a strict kind of male experience and female experience, that people identify in many different ways, in gender non-conforming and gender non-binary ways, in our trans women and trans men, and transition around their sexuality, and their identities around that, means that there's this space where, and this is often, I used to work a lot with young people through Girls Action, and to me that was some of the most exciting spaces, where there was this kind of queer fluidity around gender that, you know, is kind of a personal experience and a community experience, but also when you think about it, culturally influences in a really powerful way the ways in which we are able to break binaries, you know, and find other ways out. I'm really inspired these days by Nora Bateson's work, and she talks about third context. So when you're stuck in a kind of a binary where, you know, you have, you know, you're tete-a-tete and you can't move, you know, the third context is the way out. And I think there's lots of really important learning in the queer community around how to do that beautifully and gracefully, and how to, you know, dissolve some of those boundaries that are assumed in some of the dominant cultural contexts. Lots of rich learning there, and inspiring leadership and art and thought as well.
Yeah, and I think, Tatiana, we often see too in group dynamics, what Wilfred Bion calls pairing, right? Two people just start going at it and everyone else kind of sits back. And, you know, one way to break that is to say, okay, you two be quiet for a while and let's hear from everyone else, which brings in the nuance, right?
Yeah.
I want to check with Rachel, anyone else around binary breaking? Are there any other questions or observations? Rachel, Tatiana, what else are you seeing here that's coming up for you?
I like the question, what isn't feminist? And my reaction to that would be just this kind of scaling up, scaling out business, where it's like, let's just go big really quickly. Let's just speed through the whole kind of, let's just innovate. And yeah, it just, I just really feel like it just doesn't work. You know, that really, we all know from our personal experience, like somebody can tell you to work with somebody else. You know, this quite often happens with a funder dynamic coming in as well. Like somebody can say, you two need to collaborate together. If you don't get on with that person for whatever reason, there isn't trust and understanding built and time spent on understanding the other perspective, then there can be a million ways in which you can be an obstacle to that project moving forward. And so, yeah, slowing down and like taking your time to understand where somebody else is coming from, for me, is a more feminist way of coming up with them.
It's so interesting. I think there was a comment about the feminine in systems change. And it's, you know, as somebody who had come to this work with that lens, you know, deeply rooted, it was surprising to me. Like I find the systems change space, you know, part of its creative possibility is that it's really aligned with the feminine when we talk about like the masculine energies and feminine energies, right? Like the relational, the understanding interconnectivity is this move towards the feminine. And yet there's this weird kind of tension, I think, because in so many of those spaces that I've been in, they were often older white men led, kind of teaching that. They were often still very masculine spaces, which is what I think Rachel's talking about. So there's this kind of this unconscious tension between the two. And I'm really excited about bringing more consciousness to that and really naming, you know, what's happening around power and what's happening around who's being propped up and who isn't, around this kind of idea of the feminine and the masculine, like that we want more harmony, and we're trying to come into balance around those things. And we need to bring kind of the lived experience to that, and the recognition that there's still very patriarchal systems that are driving things, and so it's a creative space to be in. And there was another question around perseverance in this, and it's interesting because it's been years that we've been working on this and emerging this framework and the practice, and it's been I think feminist work is still very siloed, and underfunded and under-resourced. So when we're working from a gender-specific space, like trying to work around gender-based violence, which is so cultural and so interconnected to so many things that we're working in, yet that work is still so devalued. So, I think there's persistence in really trying to bring these two together, so that not only can the systems practice benefit from a feminist lens, but that gender work that's looking at gender-based violence, so that's looking at like these persistent inequities like feminized poverty, etc., like we could go on and on, that they need to be not siloed anymore. And if we can center them and resource them through kind of a systems intention, then we could do some really good work. But that requires, it's persistence, because it's bridging work, and it's bridging two fields that are not that familiar with each other. Like I can also say it's a challenge sometimes to be working in a feminist space where, people on the front lines of that work are fed up and tired, and they don't want another kind of expert coming in and saying, this is the way you need to think about things. Often feminists are like, we've been doing this for a really long time, and we're tired, and we don't need your fancy schmancy new talk, academic speak, blah, blah, blah. So there's a bridging that's very strategic and intentional, and also thoughtful and gracious, I think, that is part of that persistence as well, and continuing that work.
So I'm really curious about either someone who contributed or voted for how hungry we are for feminine principles and systems. Like, what's the nature of that hunger? Would someone mind unmuting and sharing? I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. Anyone, either the person who contributed it or anyone who voted for that.
Hi, this is
Miranda.
Miranda.
Hi.
I wrote that after our group intro chat, because I just find that what I really felt and witnessed in that was just this like bubbling up energy of sharing stories and experiences and relationships and powerful sort of women that have impacted our lives. Most of my group talked about their mothers and the pioneering ways that they opened up paths for them in their lives. And for me, there's also just like this intangible thing that I can't maybe name, of just like being drawn to this topic and just being really, I feel like this energetic hunger to just be in a space where it's being talked about. Like I don't know, I'm probably like many I hear get a little bit numbed out by these virtual gatherings. But for me, just even sitting and just like bathing in the energy of this space, even if I'm not kind of picking up on everything, is filling a real gap in my life. So that's where that comes from. Thanks.
Nice. Anyone else? We won't go back to Slido here, but you can see what's there, or maybe there's just something coming up that someone would like to share or ask with Tatiana and Rachel. And it could just be, I really love this, and here's why.
This is Steve. I really love this because it feels like it's filling some void that's been in my work for a long time. And this is not the first time I'm encountering these kinds of ideas, but I'm so appreciative that there's more and more of this growing and becoming present and visible. I'm grateful for that. And I'm curious whether the notion of interdependence, how people see that with respect to it being a feminist principle. I think of it that way because of the bearing on relationships and, cultivating and nurturing relationships. But there's also just a fact of life aspect to it as well.
Thanks, Steve. We have Faye in the chat. Faye, would you mind sharing a bit about what prompted your question about centering lived experience?
So I'm doing a doctorate at Glasgow Uni, and I'm researching the role of women with lived experience of gambling harms in policy. And as I'm getting further into my studies, I'm realizing that many of the voices of women who've been harmed by this particular issue, their voices are often denigrated, they're not valued, they're not seen as having credibility. And I'm new to systems change thinking, and I'm interested to know a little bit more about how centering lived experience would work within this, when you're framing it in this way.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think so important. And there's different ways I think that we can think about how this shows up. And I also just want to acknowledge, Faye, your reflection on the fact that often women's voices are denigrated, and it is, I think still happens, where perspectives and experiences around what I call the harms of those systems, of the violence, of the marginalization, where from the dominant perspective, there can be an invisibilization that happens, right? And so that's why when we think about decentering, it's like there's multiple ways we can decenter resources and perspectives by moving out of that dominant center. And so strategically, if you're working in systems change and you're working at an ecosystem level where you're gathering kind of the different actors in the system, we must center lived experience in some way, whether that's having people represented in that kind of ecosystem work, or whether it's bridging in some way so that people who are located there, that those experiences are lifted up. And I also think, what's interesting, we come from a place of, or in the work around social innovation, that's also, a field of practice that's kind of connected to systems change. And in theory, we always say that, the innovative ideas come from the edges and from the margins, right? And so if we honor that truth, that's what's been so inspiring for me around feminist work, is there's so many beautiful, brilliant solutions and ideas that exist in communities that are not in the center of everything, and that understand the harms in very particular ways. There's innovation, there's vision, there's energy, there's beauty, there's possibility. And, that's, I think, that's where the hope lives from my perspective. So that is key and critical. And we talk about that as shifting power in systems work. And I think if you're not doing that, if the dominant center is getting together and having a good old time, hanging out and building relationships, this is also where we're critical about it. It's like, if the dominant center can only see itself and they care about themselves in their relationship, that's not going to shift anything. That just perpetuates the same old. So it's really important, I think, to be doing that kind of re-centering.
Yeah, I so agree with what you're saying. It's inspiring, and I'm thinking of a lot of third sector organisations, for example, where they talk about valuing lived experience, but the people who are making the decisions and the policy and applying for funding are experts, are professionals, but the lived experience isn't there, and people can't seem to. There seems to be a status quo there, or an interest in maintaining a status quo that's a bit worrying.
Yeah, I hear you.
Thanks for
maybe,
sharing that.
yeah, thanks. I just would like to add one more thought that I think is really inspiring. Again, it comes from the work that Nora Bateson's doing, and it's a way in to kind of unpack some of that. Is she talks about how, you know, the ways in which the systems that what we're built on, like historically, some of the dominant systems in the West, the way they are built, in the othering that happens, there's a pathologizing that happens also. And so to be conscious of like good intention systems change that wants to fix and solve the problems is perpetuating a pathologizing, of problematizing things that are not necessarily problematic. So I think that's a really inspiring, her work is really inspiring, I think, as well.
Tatiana and Rachel, we had a question from Sylvia about defining lived experience.
And what's the question? It's
How do you define lived experience?
Yeah.
We've used that term a few times now.
Yes. I think it depends on the context. So, you know, if we're talking about climate change, I think we're talking about people who are living the impact of climate change, which can be then in a region or, you know, geographically. And if we're talking about gender-based violence, you know, we're talking about people who have experienced that. If we're talking about poverty, it's people who are experiencing that. And I think there's an element to this, Rachel and I also talk about in our work. Another dimension to it is really creating the spaces where people can be human. You know, so we all have our, what do we do in the world? And so I'm doing systems change and my title is systems change. And, you know, that can cut me off from my humanity in terms of how I show up in the spaces that I'm working in. So there's also a conscious effort to bring in context, to ground ourselves, to locate ourselves so that we are actually, you know, opening and being more spacious to the human in the work we do, regardless of where we are. And that brings in people's individual lived experience, right? Who are we more than the job titles that we hold? And who are we more than the actors in the system that does one thing particular?
And I see Beck responded there too. I think it was from Brenda Zimmerman, Tatiana, that I first heard of the distinction between content experts, right? The subject matter experts we consult to talk about homelessness or whatever, and then context experts, people with lived experience of the issue. I think we have time for maybe a couple more items. I'm seeing that Alberta put something about, I'm working with an organization that's addressing homelessness. Actually, Alberta, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just unmute. You could maybe share a bit about that.
Thank you. I'm working with an organization that is really addressing the homeless crisis in Eugene with a real systems change approach. And some things have happened now where conflict has arisen, and actually the whole systems change aspect of it may go away because of the conflict. It seems to me that feminist practice would probably be an antidote in this situation, and I'm wondering if you've ever come into that crisis situation, and whether you've actually introduced it successfully. It is there's 3 principles. 2 of them are heavily steeped in hierarchy and that system, even though when things were going well, they were ready for systems change, but when they defaulted back. I think feminist practice might be helpful here. Have you ever seen that work in a crisis situation?
Right, thank you. You know, yes, and I think, you know, part of the hardest work we're doing is in that working across difference, right? And so I think that it comes down to, for me, I think an intersectional lens, when we're looking through that and we're entering into systems work, it makes us think about things like, how are we creating the conditions to work across difference, and what needs to be considered? Like, how are people experiencing the issues that we're trying to address? And how do we create the space where people can show up and work together and collaborate? And it's hard work. It's a lot of work. It's just attending to those relationships. And but I do think it's the lens of feminist practice that needs to be brought into a space, so that the ways in which we're doing systems change takes power and location and identity into consideration as it moves forward. And no, it's not just like a checkbox or an add-on. It's like, it's actually integrated. We talk about feminist practice as integrated into everything. So we could probably talk more offline about that, Alberta, because I hear you. And I do think, it's hard work. And so is to acknowledge, I think that kind of conflict is something that when you're really in the thick of it, that you're dealing with it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that might kind of relate to Marty's question. How do you integrate men into a predominantly feminine space?
Hi,
Rachel?
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Marty.
Yeah, you can hear me, can you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm involved with a professional organization that focuses on systems sciences, and it was started probably about 70 years ago, essentially as an old boys academic club. And so it definitely has a very academic focus, but it is shifting towards being more scholar practitioner and looking at the practice of system sciences. But the situation has gotten to a point where a lot of the women have just gotten fed up with the men. And so we created what we're calling the Circle of Women in Systems Thinking. And we've actually had a number of men who say they want to join. And we basically said, no, this is for women. But we also realized that at some point, we're not going to solve this problem without getting men involved. And so we've been really struggling with, there are women who want to keep their safe space, and there are men who want to know more. And we've been struggling with we use the circle method. So we've been struggling with how do we integrate men into this? How do we introduce them to different ways of engaging besides the competitive, combative process that they seem to enjoy? So I'm curious what your perspective is.
Great, that's a great question. Rachel, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll take that one to start with. That's good. Okay, well, I think there's two things. First is, I think it's completely legitimate to keep a safe space. And, one of the coolest things about our system sisterhood was just having that conversation, just having that conversation with other women identified people, and just being able to kind of not be shiny and professional, just be honest about the fact that you've been up all night, or like you're ill, or you've got like something else going on, and also having a conversation about work, because you can do both. But just doing all being welcome in that space. And it's hugely powerful and really important. And I think what happens over a period of time is that you start to understand what's the culture that we're creating collectively when it's just us. And that's important, because I don't know about anybody else, but because I've always worked in male-dominated fields previously, I didn't know what that culture was. It took me some time to just be in a women-centered space to know what that culture was like. But then at the same time, Tatiana and I have always worked with men as well. And so we run programs, like training programs around systems thinking, and lots of men, come, it's like 50-50. But we're just hosting it in culture because we've got really clear on what our culture is. And we do meditation without being embarrassed. And we just talk about things in the background without any big deal made of it. And we're honest about, we don't want you to come here and show off. We don't want to hear about your credentials. We just want you to be honest about what you're thinking about. And so we have set these cultural principles and we embody it. And then everybody starts to do it. And everyone starts to behave in that way. And so I think that's my take on how it's done, is just that you have to be clear on what is it that your culture you want, because this is the kind of thing that we at Systems Sanctuary feel like we want to spread in the world, is the kind of culture that we create on our program. We want that to spread, and that's our way of doing systems change, And so, but you have to do it first, and then you have to try and think of ways to spread it.
And I would just add that, I think there are a lot of amazing feminist men in the world, and a lot of men who are in touch with their feminine, and who also crave those spaces that are kind of not, hierarchical and in these kind of patriarchal dominant ways. So as Rachel said, I think it can be both and, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. And finding ways to integrate is exciting, and possible. Yeah.
So thank you both. I want to share that Tatiana and Rachel are reachable, systemsanctuary.com. I think Melissa's going to share a few resources before we close, if you want to learn more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Russ. I just dropped the link again to the website in the chat. And we will share out these slides where this publication is hyperlinked for continued learning. I just want to thank Tatiana and Rachel so much for being with us and sharing your frameworks and your wisdom with us. And this 90 minutes has just flown by for me. I don't know how others are feeling, but if we had extra time, we could keep talking, I know, for a long time. And I hope that we all find spaces to continue this conversation. So lots of good information you can get at systemsanctuary.com. And then please check them out on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Good information. You can find more about the work that Tatiana and Rachel are doing there as well. So I'd like to invite you all to also stay in touch with us. Many of you heard about this opportunity through our newsletter. If you haven't registered, please make sure that you mark yourself down so that you can know about future events like this one that we will host. Co-Creative also has a training coming up in May. Please reach out to me if you'd like more information on that. And I know that folks are popping off. I'd invite everybody to come off of mute and share a departing greeting before you move on to other parts of your day. And again, thank you so much for being with us.
So
you so much.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
everybody.
for all your work.
Bye.